So we left off last class talking about demand, things that shift demand. We'll kind of transition today. I said we'll talk about supply, go a little bit quicker through that than we did demand because it's similar kind of principles. I changed the slides that I had uploaded on Canvas a little bit of the order. I will say based off the first section, when we get down here to surpluses and shortages, we probably won't have time to cover that today. But that module 3 quiz that I'll make available after class will cover everything else except for surpluses and shortages. Okay, so everything else will be fair game. Where are we at? But that surplus and shortage, we'll probably finish up on that on Monday. So that's not expected to be on the module 3 quiz. However, it will be expected for the exam next Thursday, which we'll talk more about that next week. Once again, we usually would have exams on Friday. However, because of the 4th, we'll be doing it on Thursday. So we'll finish up module 3 Monday, start module 4, complete module 4 by the end of the day Tuesday. Wednesday's class will be a review. I kind of work through practice problems. I'll pick and choose, but that would be a good time for you to bring your questions that you have over those practice problems for that first exam. And then Thursday will be the slot that's available for that first midterm exam. Okay. I'll get this participation quiz here. There was an issue with the first section. Let's make sure I have the time set. Yeah, so it should be available. Okay. This one was okay. Nope, we'll go back to the home page. Other than that, that should take us through all the housekeeping stuff. Any questions for me before we dive into material here today? This a little bit just in case so I can see the chat a little better. Okay. All right. So last class we talked about demand, this relationship between price and quantity demanded, things that shift demand. Today we're going to talk about supply. So everything's going to be kind of flipped from last class. Consumers, the people that demand or that are buying something, right? The producers are going to be, or the sellers are who is supplying it. So just like we have quantity demanded, we're going to have quantity supply. So at every single price for a good, we've got how much a company or a producer will be willing to supply. The combination of all those price and quantity supplied will give us our supply curve, right? Now, the opposite of demand, right? We said that when the price goes up, people want to buy less. If I'm selling a good, right? When the price goes up, people actually are going to want to be more likely to sell things. So for example, if the real estate prices go up, all of a sudden I can sell my house for a higher amount than I paid for it. Maybe I'd be willing to supply that house to the market where I wasn't before. So when prices go up, we generally think about there's more people or a company is willing to supply more units to the market. So here we've got price and quantity supplied actually move in the same direction. So when we think about producers or suppliers, price is a good thing, right? Because that's how much money they're making when they sell something. Okay. So just like we had a demand schedule, we'll have a supply schedule. This is just going to show us all the different combinations of possible prices for the good and how much a company would be willing to supply. So back to our orange mocha frappuccino example, right? If the price of those is 0, I'm not willing to supply any of them to the market. Now, if the price raises to $1, maybe I'm willing to go out, hire a worker. They can produce, 3 of these drinks per hour, or I don't know, 3 drinks per 10 minutes, whatever the time frame is. And then as I want to sell more and more, right? Or sorry, as the price goes up higher and higher, I'm willing to want to sell more and more of these goods, right? And we'll talk through this a little bit more with some examples here in a second, but this is the idea of quantity supplied is increasing as we increase that price. So just like we had our demand schedule and our demand curve, we can take all of these different price quantity supplied combinations, start to graph them. If we were to plot all of them, we can kind of think about, well, these aren't the only quantities we can supply. We can supply any amount in between. We're going to end up with that relationship between price and quantity supplied. That entire curve, or sorry, all of those combinations will be our entire supply curve. Okay. So just like, excuse me, our demand curve, we said the slope represented how much the price would have to fall for someone to want to buy one more unit. With supply, the slope of our supply curve tells us about the relationship between price and quantity supplied. It's how much the price would have to increase in order for us to provide or supply one more unit to the market. So our supply schedule, supply curve, very similar to the demand curve, except for you'll notice the supply curve is increasing instead of decreasing. So behind every curve on a graph is an equation. So just like we had our demand equation, we'll have our supply equation. We're going to keep it linear. So we're going to have what was on our X and our Y axis. Well, price is on our Y axis still. Quantity, not quantity demanded, but now quantity supplied, is still going to be on our X axis. So we've got price as a function of quantity. We're going to have some intercept and some slope. In our example, what was the intercept? What was an easy one? At a price of 0, what was the quantity supplied? Or at that quantity supplied of 0, what's the price? 0. So we have like an intercept of 0 here. Now we can have supply curves that start out like at 2, right? Which would mean even if the price were $2, this company would be willing to supply 0 units. So the intercept is sometimes 0 for our supply curve, but it can be a positive amount as well. Now, if I want to calculate the slope here, how would I do that? It's the same thing that we were doing for the demand curve. Change in Y over change in X. What's on our Y axis? Price. Quantities on our X axis. So I could choose any 2 points here and calculate the slope. So if I go from $1 to $2, what's the change in my price or my Y axis variable? 1. Divided by the change in X, I'm going from 3 to 6. So there it would be what? 1 over 3, right? So just like we could kind of figure out from a supply schedule and from a graph what our intercept and slope was for a demand curve, we can do the same thing for the supply curve. Okay? And I already mentioned, what does that slope represent? It's the price increase that we would require to supply one more unit to the market. Okay? Any questions there before we keep moving? Okay. So we said the demand curve reflected the marginal benefits to consumers. So the supply curve isn't going to tell us about the marginal benefit, but it's telling us about what the ability and willingness of a supplier is to produce and supply a unit or a good to the market. So it's not telling us the marginal benefit, it's going to be telling us something about that firm's marginal costs. Okay. So we can interpret the supply curve as marginal costs, and I'll show you an example here, kind of visual as to why we can think of it that way. And then using that supply curve, can we calculate the marginal cost of a different number of units? Okay. So we'll switch over to the dot cam here. I'll try to give you some insight as to why the supply curve represents marginal costs. Okay. So if I've got quantity, price, and I've got my supply curve here, let's just for a second assume that the price was $2. Okay. I believe, if we look back at that supply schedule, I think that was happening at a quantity of 6. Let me make sure that's correct. Yeah. So if the price were $2, right? Well, that was the first price where we saw that 6th unit supplied to the market. So what must have been true? Well, if the price was only $1.50, right? We were getting a lower level of production, but why? Well, just like a consumer will only buy something if the marginal benefit is greater than or equal to the marginal cost, that's going to be true for suppliers as well. Now, for the consumer, we are thinking about price was actually a bad thing. That was their marginal cost. But for the producer, that price is how much money they're making. That's their marginal benefit. So here, if the price were $1.50, I'm not supplying that 6th unit because the price is my marginal benefit. If that's below my marginal cost, that's what we're saying the supply curve would represent, I'm not going to supply that 6th unit at $1.50. In fact, what would the price have to be in order for me to supply that 6th unit? It would have to be $2. That's the first price where that price would be exactly equal to my marginal cost. That's the very first price at which I provide that sixth unit. And then if the price goes any higher, well, I'll keep on supplying that sixth unit because now the marginal benefit is even greater than the marginal costs. And I might even now be willing to supply these units here, which had a higher marginal cost than when the price was lower. So that's why our supply curve is representing marginal cost, because it's the very first price where I'd supply that. It means I know that's the very first price that would be equal to my marginal cost. Right? And every price greater than that, now that price is above. So the reason why there is, for consumers, price was their cost, their marginal cost. For producers, that price is their marginal benefit. Okay? So if this supply curve represents my marginal cost, we said with demand, and let's see if I can remember these numbers. I think this was our demand curve from last class, right? We said another way you can think of this price, it was representing the marginal benefit of different quantities to the consumer. So we could plug in, 5, figure out the marginal benefit of the fifth unit, plug in a 6, find the marginal benefit of the sixth. Same kind of idea. So this was our demand from last class. If I'm looking at instead my supply equation, we said that the point that we're at on that supply curve, the price that we're first willing to supply that unit, that would represent the marginal cost of that unit. So we can think of price in our supply curve as really telling us the marginal cost. How would I find the marginal cost then of, say, the second unit? Just plug in a 2 into that quantity, and I get the marginal cost of my second unit is what? 2/3. What about the cost of the ninth unit? Plug in a 9 into quantity, I get the marginal cost of the ninth unit would be what? 3. And then I could do that for any quantity that I'm interested in. This was supposed to be a 9. Okay? So similar idea, just from a different perspective now, the producer. Okay? All right. So we can think of the supply curve as marginal cost. We can determine what those marginal costs are. Now, what we'll notice is, remember I said the supply curve is upward sloping, so it's always going to have a positive slope. Well, if it has a positive slope and these prices represent the marginal cost, when I'm looking at a higher quantity, what's happening to the marginal cost of each of those units? Well, if the supply curve represents marginal cost, they are increasing. So just like we had diminishing marginal benefit from our demand curve, our supply curve shows us that for these producers, there's going to be increasing marginal costs. So the idea here would be something like this. If I want to, sell a certain number of drinks at Starbucks every day, maybe in order to do so, I hire one worker for those first few drinks. But if I want to get past a quantity of 10, maybe now that one worker can't process everything, I need to hire a second worker. So every time I want to produce more, I might have to hire another worker. I've increased my cost once I get to a certain quantity. Or if I'm a really large company, if I want to go, sell more units, maybe I have to upgrade my production facility, right? If I want to produce more than 1,000 units. And if I want to produce more than 2,000 units, I got to get even larger production facility. So all the factors that go into producing a good, but I'm going to need more and more of those to increase my quantity supplied. Well, which ones am I going to choose first? So if I'm thinking about my worker example, who am I going to first choose to hire? And let's say we're hiring people at the minimum wage. So they all cost the same. Well, I'm going to hire the most effective worker first. So maybe the first worker I hire can produce 10 drinks an hour, paying them, $10. Okay. Well, what if I want to go past 10? That one worker can only make 10 drinks. I'll have to hire a second worker, paying them the exact same amount of money per hour, $10, but now maybe they can only produce 5 drinks. I'm now having to pay more per drink, right? My marginal cost, if I want to produce past that 10th drink, has now went up. And the reason why we know that'll be the case is, well, we might be like, well, what if you hired that second worker first? Well, why would you? You always are going to be hiring the most effective worker first, or you're always going to be choosing the most effective production facility first when it comes to producing that first, second, third unit. And then as you want to produce more, you have to start using less and less effective workers or less and less effective resources, essentially. If they're less effective, that's increasing your marginal costs, okay, per unit. Okay. All right. So any questions there before we keep moving? So just like with demand, we have one company's supply curve, right? We might have an individual supply curve. We might also be interested in market supply, all right? So let's say instead of just Starbucks, I now have two companies, Starbucks and Jitterbug. How would I find market supply? Well, if I know how much each company will produce at these various prices, I have two individual supply curves. My market supply curve would just be simply at every price, how much are both companies going to supply? So here, 0, 5, 10. Market supply is simply the sum of all the individual supply curves at these various prices. Okay, so we did the same exact thing for demand. Shouldn't be anything too crazy here. Okay, so once I have my market supply curve, I now have these different prices and the resulting total quantity supplied in that market. Okay. This will be kind of our supply or our market supply curve that we'll use for some of the things we talk about later on today. Okay. What's going to happen if I add, I'm doing a little bit of foreshadowing here. We'll save us some time later. What's going to happen if I add a third firm? So if I add a third firm at every single price, I'm not only adding up these two firms' supply, I would be adding a third. So all of these quantity supply values would be higher. So at every single price, I would end up with a quantity supply that's higher or a market supply curve that is further away from this point of 0. Okay. Any questions on that idea before we keep on moving here? So we're now going to talk about, okay, what are some things that might shift this supply curve? Okay. So just like with demand, we said demand represented the relationship between price and quantity demanded. Supply, our entire supply curve, will represent the relationship between price and quantity supplied, holding all these other factors equal. So what are some of these other factors that could change supply? So it's not going to change the slope of our supply curve, but it's going to shift that supply curve. So what are all of these other things? Now, when we talk about supply increases and decreases, it gets a little bit tricky. Okay. And I'll draw something out that I think will help. So just like with demand, I was using not up and down when I was describing the shifts. I was using right and left. There's a reason why, because when it comes to supply, if you think about it as up and down, it can confuse you a little bit as opposed to thinking about right or left. So increases in supply, just like an increase in demand, is a rightward shift. Decreases in supply, just like a decrease in demand, is a leftward shift. So here, I'll kind of show you, if you don't think of these as directly left and right, notice a supply decrease. It looks like supply is going up, like shifting up, but we'll talk about why that's not what this graph is showing us in a second. And then supply increases, what looks like it's shifting down. So I'll show you probably a better way than these two. This would be probably like a very not great reference to kind of go back to. I just wanted to use this to highlight why if you look at this as like an up and down shift, you can get it confused with increases and decreases. So instead, I'll show you the way that I would think about supply increases and decreases. So let's say I've got my supply curve here. Okay. Here's the 0 point. A supply increase would mean that at every single price, right, I am now, for example, let's do the, I'll get an easy one out of the way. If I have more producers, more companies, at every price, I'm now going to have a higher quantity supplied. So an increase in the quantity supplied would mean that at that same price, there's now more people or there's a higher quantity supplied. At every price, there's more companies or a higher quantity supplied. So a rightward shift is actually going to be an increase in our supply curve. Another way of thinking about this is if your curve is shifting away from that 0 point, the origin, you're having an increase. Right? Now, what if you have a decrease in supply? Right? So if I had a decrease in supply, what we're thinking about there is at every price, I now see that the companies are willing to supply less. So a leftward shift is a decrease in supply or moving closer to that 0 point, right? That point where quantity supplied is equal to 0. So decreases in supply, instead of thinking about up and down, thinking about it as a leftward shift, and then increases in supply, thinking about this more as a rightward shift. Okay. Any questions on the idea of kind of this shift before we talk about what's actually causing these shifts? Okay. All right. So we'll skip ahead here a little bit. I'll come back to these slides. So we kind of already talked about this one. I think this is an easy one, but just the number of sellers, right, is going to, just like if we have more consumers, we had more individual demand curves, our market demand is going to be even higher. If we have a higher number of producers or sellers, we have more individual supply curves to add up, so our supply curve is going to be higher. So like in our earlier example, if we had not only 2 producers of these orange mocha frappuccinos, but a third, right? If we go back, I would be adding up not just these 2 companies, I'd be adding a third in. My new market quantity supplied are going to be even higher. So adding in more producers, just like in adding in more consumers, is going to increase our supply curve. Okay. Now, the ones that are a little bit, I think, a little more different from what we talked about with demand might be something like changes in input prices. So if I think about input prices, there's some intuitive result or some things we can think about intuitively, and then I'll give you some other ways to think about it as well. So if it now costs me more money to produce the same good, right? Just intuitively, am I going to be more or less likely to want to produce and sell that good in the market? Less likely, right? My marginal cost of producing it have now went up, right? It's less likely I can make a profit. Right? So whenever we have input prices go up, we're going to see that supply actually goes down. And I think that makes sense. If it costs more money to make something, we're going to supply less of it. Now, if it costs less money to make it, we're going to see that they want to supply even more than they were before. Right? So some examples of this might be, if I had sugar prices go up, I'm not going to want to supply as much candy. Cost of milk goes down. These orange mocha frappuccinos, if I require milk to make them, I'll supply more. Putting in this just in a different market, what about like fast food companies? Well, if minimum wages go up, what did I essentially do for those companies? Most of them have minimum wage employees. So if I increase the minimum wage, what have I done to their input prices? It now costs them more money to produce the same goods they were before. They're actually going to decrease their supply. Okay. So just kind of a slightly different input price, right, of minimum wage. These ones I think are a little more easier to think about, like, I need sugar to make candy, I need milk to make a frappuccino, etc. Okay. So I've got one way of thinking about input prices here, and then I'll show you another on the dot cam. So if my input prices go down, right, then we can think about at every price, right, I am now willing to supply more. So we said before, I'm willing to supply something when that marginal cost is less than or equal to my marginal benefit. So if my marginal costs go down, I'm now willing to supply more units than I was before. So at every price, we would see quantity supplied go up. Okay. Now, another way of thinking about this is if the supply curve represents my marginal costs, we have this supply curve, it represents my marginal costs. If my input prices, if the price goes down, well, what's happening at every single quantity? If my input prices are now lower, my marginal costs have fallen. And that's true at every quantity. So you can think of the reason why a rightward shift is going to be an increase in supply is because when my costs are lower, I'm willing to supply more, right? I'm getting further away from this 0 point. So at every price, quantity supply is going up, or you can think about it at every quantity, my costs to produce that good are going down. So I'm now going to be willing to supply some units before that I wasn't. Okay. Think about it this way. Let's say here's what the price of the good was. Hmm. When my marginal costs were up here, I was only going to be providing these units. When my costs are lower, well, now every unit in this range, my marginal costs are now below. Remember, the price is the marginal benefit to producers. I'm now willing to supply all of these as well. Okay. So kind of two different ways of thinking about these increases in supply and really how these input prices are going to cause me to see this increase or rightward shift in supply. Now, what's another thing that would lower my input prices or lower my production costs, right? So it's almost directly related to what we just talked about, but this would be any changes in technology. Okay, let's get this out of here. In fact, I don't want this showing up. There it goes. So anytime I have a technology change, it's essentially going to mean to get the same number of units, I now have more efficient technology. I actually can produce it at a lower cost. Or said differently, if I want to produce, if I want to produce the same number of units, I can now do it at a lower cost is the best way to think about a technology change. Right? So it's like if I have the same number of workers, they can now produce more units than they were before. I'm still paying them the same, but I can get more output. Okay? So really any cost saving technology is just going to be a reduction in input prices. So it's really just a fancy way of saying input prices are lower. Right? And we've already kind of discussed why that would be a shift to the right. Okay? Now, yeah, that's why we love technology, right? Because I can't think of many examples where we would actually see like a technology development, right? Where technology gets worse. I guess it could maybe after a war or something like that. But generally, technology is always going to increase supply. Okay. We already talked about the number of sellers. So what about expectations? So to be completely transparent, we're going to focus just on price expectations when it comes to supply. There are market expectations that will matter. It's just that they're specific to every market, and I'm not going to expect you to like know how all these different things changing could impact, I don't know, the market for what's a good example of something that's just bizarre, honey or something like that, right? So market expectations matter. So an example of this would be like, if I think it's going to be a colder winter than it typically is, and that more people are going to want natural gas and be willing to pay more, then maybe I stockpile my current supply. So my current supply actually goes down because I want to hold on to it and sell it when I know that people are going to be more likely to pay more money for it. So really these market expectations, the way that they're going to change supply is really because it's market expectations I have that I think is going to impact the price. So we really just want to focus on price expectations here. And here's where supply and demand, because we're looking at this from two different viewpoints or two different lenses, it's the exact opposite of what we talked about with demand. Because price for the suppliers, if I'm selling this good, price is a good thing, right? So if I think prices are going to be higher in the future, what might I currently do? So if I think that gas prices are going to skyrocket overnight because of the Middle East conflicts, as a gas company, what might I want to do today? Well, I only have so much gas, I can't get it there quickly. Maybe I won't sell it today, so I can sell it at the higher price tomorrow. Right? So if I think prices will be higher tomorrow, my current supply might actually go down. So my brother is big into like sports cards and selling them in all these shows. If he has a card that he thinks is going to rise in value over the next couple months, does he bring it to his card show to try to sell it today? No. He limits this, he lowers the supply because he wants to sell it when the price is going to be higher. So this is the idea of kind of expected prices. There, I want prices to be high if I'm a seller. And then on the flip side, if I think prices are going to be lower moving forward, so maybe I have a home and I think the real estate market is going to crash, maybe I want to make sure I put it on the market and try to get rid of it today. So lower expected prices mean if I'm selling something, I want to make sure I currently sell it so my current supply would go up. Puts us in touch. Oh, yeah. Well, you could talk to me after class. Right? He all around Indiana. So if you go to card show, or in Michigan, so if you go to card shows in the Midwest, he's likely there. He may have asked me for some advice here or there. Anyways, I digress. So what are some other things that would shift supply? Oh, you're fine. No, you're fine. I love it. So we also have related goods, just like we did for consumption, right? So we've got substitutes and we've got complements, right? So I've got some examples here, and I'm actually going to use these examples and just write them out. So you'll have the kind of general idea here, but I'm going to do one where I write these out for us here. Okay. So if I think about substitutes in production, these are going to be things that using all of my using my current resources, I can actually produce one of two things. So an example of this I always think about is like a farmer, a field. So if I can plant corn or soybeans, right? If the price of corn, so these are going to be substitutes in production, I can either plant corn or I can plant soybeans, right? If for whatever reason the price of corn skyrockets, right? If I'm making a decision about what I want to plant this year, what am I going to be more likely to want to plant? Corn is a higher price and I'm selling it. I'm going to increase how much corn I might choose to plant corn in my field, but not plant soybeans. So the producers of this good, when substitutes in production, the price of one good goes up, the quantity of the other goes down, or the supply, we can think about it of the other good, is going to go down. Okay. So substitutes in production, I'll substitute towards whatever has a higher price because I'm selling it, away from whatever has a lower price. Okay. Any questions on that idea? And then the flip side, right? If I think the price of, you can even do it this way. If the price of soybeans is going down, what's going to happen to the supply of corn? Well, if soybeans, I can sell them for less money, I'm going to be more likely to want to plant corn, so we would see the supply of corn increase. These are working in opposite directions. Okay. Now, we have complements in production. So I used to use this example where it was like kind of goofy, but sawdust. And then if I'm thinking about the supply of, like, I don't know, wooden chairs or something, well, inherently to produce something out of wood, to cut the wood, I'm going to get a byproduct, which is sawdust. So the idea of complements in production is that by producing or supplying wooden chairs, I'm automatically getting a second good as well. So if the price of that second good goes, we'll do this one first. If it goes down, well, then I just have this like worthless byproduct. I'm actually going to be less likely to want to produce more chairs. Okay. I'll do another example that I think maybe is a little bit more applicable. The sawdust one's a bit of a stretch. But during the pandemic, what do you think happened to the price of hand sanitizer? People were way more likely to pay a higher price for it. So what ended up happening was that, and I went to a distillery and we talked about this. It was kind of interesting. So like whiskey or vodka, any of these high alcohol, any liquor. I think it was at you're in Indianapolis and you're 21, or when you are 21, go to a place called Hotel Tango. They have some amazing whiskeys. But I did a little like tour of their place, and they said during the pandemic, they figured out that when they make whiskey and these other high alcohol, vodka, things like that, they get this like byproduct in the production process that's like pure alcohol that's not consumable, right, for people. But what it can be used to make, it basically already is hand sanitizer. So by making whiskey, they were automatically in this hand sanitizer. So when the price of hand sanitizer went up, what happened to their supply of whiskey? They actually increased their production process, right? Because in making more whiskey, they get this other good, which is now more valuable, and they can sell for more money. Right? So with complements, the price and the supply of the good work in the same direction. Okay. And then we also talked about with demand, taxes, and subsidies. Work through this one a little bit quick because I have some examples that we'll use later on in the class. And I don't think it's too tough to think about. What do taxes do to my input prices? Increase them, right? Makes it more costly. Like if I'm making something and it cost me whatever it did, now the government says, oh, you also have to pay a $10 tax. They've increased my input prices. Higher input prices, we said, decrease supply. So that's just kind of a unique case of an input price increase. So like gasoline, when the government started imposing these carbon tax emissions, you saw the gasoline production went down. Supply, I should say. What about subsidies? Well, if the government's giving someone money for making something, so this was like for a while they were giving subsidies to like windmills, right? So what did you see all around Indiana? People start to put up. Well, before they didn't find windmills profitable at the old prices, right? But now it's the price of whatever I can construct a windmill for plus this subsidy, supply increased. I'm giving, and once again, I think it's intuitive. If I'm giving producers money to make something, are they going to be more or less likely to make it than we were before? More likely to want to supply more. Same thing with agricultural products. I always give the example. I knew some farmers. I don't know enough about this to probably speak to, too in depth, but the idea of like the soil needs every so many years isn't good for planting. They used to like even give fields a rest or they cycle crops, but then they started giving subsidies for specific crops. So even though they knew it was going to be a bad year to plant corn, if corn subsidies went up, they might just say, we know we're not going to get as good of a yield, but we can overcompensate for that. Like overall, we're still going to break even on corn, and now we get these additional subsidies. We're still going to plant corn, right? So those subsidies cause them to where they would have cycled off to a different crop. They actually plant corn. They know it's not going to be a good yield, but they're getting this huge subsidy to do it, and so they increase their supply. Okay. So here's kind of our summary. I clicked on accident. Here's our summary of all these supply shifters, just like we had those demand shifters. We're now going to kind of transition into thinking about how do we combine those two things. Okay. So when I'm thinking about I've got supply and demand, price is a bad thing for consumers, good thing for producers. How do we end up seeing the actual sticker price on goods when we go to a store? Right? Why is the price of gasoline $3.30 right now? Why do we see X number of gallons currently being sold? So why do we see the current price and why do we see the current number of units being produced and consumed of a good? We're going to call these points the equilibrium. Right? So the equilibrium of a market is essentially where every unit being supplied is also being consumed. This is going to be the point where quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded, where supply is equal to demand. Okay? So the equilibrium price will be the price where quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. Okay? And then at that price, whatever that quantity is, that's our equilibrium quantity. So visually, what does this look like? And I'll show you some math examples here later. But just for now, I've got my downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply curve. Where would the equilibrium be? It's the price where both the quantity supplied and quantity demand are the exact same value, or where those two curves intersect. So here we'd have an equilibrium price of what? $3 and an equilibrium quantity of 15. Now notice, if we started out at a different price, if the price were 0, 24 people want to buy this good, but nobody wants to provide it or sell it. Well, okay, so how many units are going to actually be purchased? Well, if no one's supplying them, 0, right? What if the price is $1? Well, 21 people want to buy it, only 5 people are producing it. How many are going to be purchased? Well, there's only 5 out there. Yeah, there's more people that want to buy it, but once the first 5 are bought, that's it. So here, as long as that price keeps going up, yes, fewer people are willing to buy it, but more people are supplying it. We still see that the number of units sold, say at $2, well, now instead of 5, it's 10 and 15, right? So we know there will be pressure on the price as long as there's more people that want to buy this good than what is currently being supplied. The price will continue to increase until the number being produced and sold is the number that's being produced is exactly the same as the number being consumed at that price. Okay? So we can get that information from a demand kind of graph, or sorry, a market graph of supply and demand, or from a supply and demand schedule. Okay, so here our equilibrium price was 3, and the resulting equilibrium quantity would be 15. Okay. Any questions on that idea? Okay, I'm gonna skip this and come back to this later. So this is all the stuff, surplus and shortages, we'll talk about on Monday. I'm going to revisit this example at the very end of class just to kind of do things a little bit differently, because I want to make sure we have ample time to kind of cover, okay, once we know what we're looking for, this equilibrium point where supply is equal to demand, and once again, I'll give you some mathematical support behind why at the end of class. But for now, just take me at my word, like this equilibrium point is where supply is going to be equal to demand. In fact, just to give you a little foreshadowing, just so you don't think I'm just making this up, let's revisit a couple things we talked about. So what did we say demand represents? It represents our marginal benefits. Supply represented our marginal costs. So if you think about for like a unit down here, right, what price would someone be willing to buy, say, this 6th unit at? Well, really, any price below this point. Because that price, as long as it's below or equal to their marginal benefit, they would choose to buy it. Well, what about who would be willing to supply this? If the price was anything above 6, then they're willing to supply this unit. So there's a range of prices where the consumers and producers could come to an agreement for that 6th unit. Well, what about for the 7th unit? Well, there, the marginal benefit of the consumer, someone is willing to pay more than what it's costing the person to make it, so there's a range where they could come to an agreement. That's going to be true all the way up to the point where they're exactly equal to each other. Now, if we look past that point, let's say, I don't know, let's say this was 30. Why don't we see the 31st unit being produced and consumed in the market? Well, for that 31st unit, after we move past that point where supply is equal to demand, or after that point where the marginal benefits to that unit are equal to the marginal cost, notice what price would someone be willing to pay for that 31st unit? It would have to be a price that was equal to this or somewhere below. Well, how much is the producer willing to accept? It would have to be this price or something above. Is there any range, or is there any price where that would be true for both of these parties? No, there's no overlap. Here we had overlap, so there was some price they could come to an agreement on. Here, there won't be. So that's why we know that this market is going to stop right where supply is equal to demand, because that's where the marginal benefit of that last unit is exactly equal to the marginal cost of that last unit. Okay. All right. So instead of bouncing back to the slides and then right back here, the next thing we're going to talk about are shifts in supply and demand. Okay. So we've talked about all the things that are going to shift supply and demand. How are those going to impact our equilibrium prices and quantities? Okay. So let's say first we want to think about, I've got this market. It's currently in equilibrium. So that current equilibrium price and quantity is where supply is equal to demand. So here's my initial equilibrium price and quantity. Okay. Let's say that I've got, I don't know. We'll do this one first. Let's say we see a tax on consumers. So the first thing that we need to do in order to understand how a supply or demand shift will change the equilibrium is, well, is this going to impact supply or demand? Anytime I see this word consumer, I should be thinking about, I'm going to have a change in demand. So taxes, right? Is that going to make someone more or less likely to want to buy that good? Less likely. So we said we would see a demand decrease. Okay. So this demand decrease, what is that going to look like? Well, last class we said that means that every price we're going to have like a lower quantity demanded, So our demand curve is going to look something like this. Where is our new equilibrium point? Where does our new demand curve equal supply? It's going to be here at this, excuse me, lower price and at a lower quantity. So decreases in demand will decrease both the equilibrium price and quantity. What if instead, and I'll put these on the same graph. I think I've got some stuff in the slides later on where I'll put these on different graphs just to make it a little bit easier. But let's say I had a, I don't know. Let's say I see an decrease in income and I'm looking at an inferior good. So we said for inferior goods, when people have less money, they're actually going to want to buy more of them, or we would see a demand increase. So at every price, quantity demanded is higher. Our demand increase looks something like this rightward shift. Well, relative to the point we were starting out at, now where is our new equilibrium price and quantity? Our equilibrium price is higher. Our equilibrium quantity is higher. So a demand increase will drive both the price and the equilibrium quantity up in the market. Okay. Now, when you're working through problems, things like that, I'm only going to give you one of these shifts at a time. I'm just kind of putting them both in the same graph so we can kind of see how those shifts would change things, all in one snapshot. Okay. Questions on this before we keep moving here? Okay. All right. And here I'll draw these out separate for supply just to, since we've just started it today, we might have less of a good handle on it. So let's instead think about, what if I have something, and here we'll draw this, we'll draw two graphs. I'm going to try to get these so that they're at least pretty close, right? So here's my initial equilibrium price. Here's my initial equilibrium quantities. Okay. If I had, what's something we talked about that's a little tricky? Let's say I had substitutes in production. So maybe I can make, I don't know, I can use my restaurant to either make hot dogs or hamburgers, right? So here I've got substitutes in production. I can either, use my kitchen to make hamburgers and sell them or use it to make hot dogs. If the price of hamburgers goes up, what am I going to be more likely to want to produce them before? The thing that has a higher price. So we would see the supply of hot dogs actually would go down. So what does a decrease in supply look like? We said, remember, that's moving closer to this 0 point, this 0 line. Or at every price, we're seeing quantity supplied goes down. My supply decrease is this leftward shift. Where does my new supply curve hit the demand curve? It's going to be at a lower quantity, but at a higher price. So supply decreases are going to actually cause my equilibrium price to go up and my equilibrium quantity to go down. So supply shifts actually push these equilibrium price and quantity in opposite directions. Whereas when we had our demand shifts, notice it was pushing those two things in the same direction. Okay. So what if instead I had, let's say I've got a subsidy on, we can use or actually, what's a good example right now? Yeah, electric vehicles, right? So if I put a subsidy on electric vehicles, and I'm giving that to the producers, like whoever's producing these electric vehicles, what's going to happen to my supply? Well, if I'm giving a company money to make something, the supply is going to increase. We said that would mean that at every price, companies are willing to produce more than they were before. So my supply curve shifts to the right. It's moving further away from that 0 point. Where is my new equilibrium price and quantity? Where does my new supply curve hit my demand curve? Looks like it's out here. So that supply increase caused my price to go, oh, sorry. I'm writing too quickly. I'm also running out of room. So it caused my price, well, supply increase caused my equilibrium price to go down. Gosh, I'm talking and writing. Equilibrium price to go down and my equilibrium quantity to go up. Sorry, I need to slow myself down a little bit okay? So same kind of thing, right? Price and quantity are moving in opposite directions. It's just that, they're kind of flipped when I'm looking at a supply decrease versus a supply increase. Okay. So just to be clear, if you're labeling your own graphs and you don't want to use these arrows, this was my supply decrease. Here, this was my supply increase. Okay. All right. Any questions on anything there before we keep moving? All right. So I left these open. Here I've got some kind of summaries of just these different 4 things on separate graphs. It's basically what I just drew out, just a little bit, maybe less detailed in some ways, but just a good kind of summary slide to be able to go back to. So we're going to take a little bit of a break here and look at the quiz for today and just get a couple more examples of supply and demand shifts when they're only occurring on their own. So participation quiz. I'm going to go look at the preview. So my last section, I messed this up. Can everybody see this quiz okay? Everyone can still see my screen? One person, there we go. Perfect. Okay. So let's say I'm using this example of gasoline-powered vehicles. Okay. If the government taxes, and this is where it's important, I said taxes can impact demand or supply. So I need to see who is the tax on. Well, if it's on the production of the good, this word production is on our suppliers, our supply curve. So we should be thinking about not a shift in demand here, but a shift in supply. So hopefully we know it's either going to be C or D, right? In terms of which of these does it represents this. If I have taxes, what have I really done? I've increased the input prices. So if I increase input prices, are companies going to want to supply more or less than before? Less. What does a supply decrease look like? It's that supply curve moving towards that 0 quantity point or a leftward shift. So there, it's going to be depiction kind of D here. Now, this question doesn't ask this, but what's happening to my equilibrium price and quantity from a supply decrease? I'm seeing the equilibrium price is going up and my equilibrium quantity is going down. Okay. So even though I'm only asking you for which one of these depicts the supply decrease here, we want to be able to use that depiction to also understand what's happening to my equilibrium price and quantity. What if instead I had an example of a substitute in production? So a lot of car companies, right? I have huge production facilities and I can make either gasoline or electric power vehicles. If all of a sudden, like for whatever reason, the market for gas powered vehicles, people are less likely to want to buy them and the price goes down. Well, if I'm a producer and I can make either gas powered or electric vehicles, if the price of gas vehicles is lower, what's going to happen to my supply of electric vehicles? I'm going to take my production facilities, and instead of producing this good that I can now sell for less, I'm going to produce the good that I can sell for more. So we see them substitute away from this good that has a lower price towards the other good electric vehicles. There will be an increase in the supply of electric vehicles. So the market for electric vehicles is impacted by the price of another good here, gas vehicles. So we should see a supply increase. What's that going to look like? We said it's the supply curve shifting away from this 0 point. So an rightward shift in supply. What's that going to do? So there we've got C here, but what's that going to do to my equilibrium price and quantity? Pushes that equilibrium price down, pushes the equilibrium quantity up. And then the last one, we're going back and revisiting things that could shift demand. So let's say I subsidize the consumption of an electric vehicle. So my wife has a Jeep and it's like a hybrid, and I think we get like a certain tax credit, which is essentially a subsidy, right? So if I've got I said my wife has the Jeep, we both own it, but she's the one that wanted it, right? So if we subsidize this electric vehicle, and we're giving the money to consumers, they're going to be more likely to want to buy it. In my vehicle example, that's probably just going from 0 to 1, right? But in any other good, if I'm given a certain amount of money for how much I spend on it, I'm going to be more likely to buy more of that good. So we should see a demand increase. So a demand increase, once again, means that demand curve is moving away from that 0 point or a shift to the right. What does that do to my equilibrium quantity and price? Well, demand shifts will push both the equilibrium quantity and price in the same direction. So notice it increases both the equilibrium price and increases that equilibrium quantity. Okay. No worries. So for question 2, if I'm producing something, right? So if I can have my production facility, but it can only really be set up, say in this next month, to produce one thing, it can be gas-powered vehicles or electric power vehicles. If all of a sudden the price that I can sell gas-powered vehicles goes down, decreases, what am I more likely to switch my production facility over to? Well, if I can't sell the gas-powered vehicles for as much, I might switch over to the production of electric vehicles, meaning that supply of electric vehicles is going to increase. Okay. Yep, exactly. So that's why C was kind of depicting that. Perfect. All right. Any other questions on that before we keep moving here? Got two main things that we want to cover. So that should be good for that participation quiz. The next thing we're going to talk about are we can see simultaneous shifts in both supply and demand. So I'm going to really work through just one example here in class. There's multiple different combinations that I'll show you in the slides here. And then there's more problems you can work through in the practice problems and for the Module 3 quiz, but also for the exam. So we're just going to look through one combination of supply and demand increases, right? There's 4 different combinations, right? They can both increase, both decrease, supply increase, demand decreased, supply decrease, demand increase. So what happens if they shift at the same time? So I'm going to kind of set this up for thinking about an example where I'm looking at the market for asphalt. Right? So the very first thing we're going to think about is I've got a huge increase in the price of oil. Right? So what is that increase in the price of oil going to do? Well, it's an input into making asphalt, if you didn't know that. So my input prices go up. So I'm going to have a decrease in the supply of asphalt. Now, if people thinking about putting in a driveway or a parking lot are choosing between a gravel parking lot or an asphalt parking lot, if all of a sudden the price of gravel goes up, well, once again, this is people buying or purchasing, building, so they're the consumer. Well, here the price of a substitute good going up, I'm less likely to put in a gravel driveway, more likely to be putting in an asphalt driveway. So I'm going to have a demand increase. Okay. So I've got some stuff in the slides, but I'll show you how I would work it out by hand here. So whenever you have simultaneous changes, and I guess I can write this out fully. You don't want to draw them on the graph at the same time. You want to do each one individually. So I'm going to start out and say, okay, look, I've got my market for asphalt. Here's my supply curve. Here's my demand curve. Here's my initial equilibrium quantity and equilibrium price where supply is equal to demand. Okay. I'm then going to do a similar thing down here. I'm going to draw myself the same graph so I can understand how not only the supply decrease is going to impact this market, but how the demand increase is going to impact this market. Right? So this is just starting out in equilibrium. Okay. If I have a supply decrease, what is that going to look like? We said that would be a leftward shift, or that at every price, the quantity supplied is now lower. Okay. So what did that do to my equilibrium price and quantity? Well, my new supply curve hits my demand curve. What looks like at a higher price, lower quantity. Okay. So this decrease in supply, well, here, let's give myself more room here. So this decrease in supply did what? It pushed my equilibrium price up, but it pushed my equilibrium quantity down. Okay. If I then think about, all right, at the same time, I had this demand increase, what does that do to my equilibrium? Well, it's going to shift my demand curve to the right, right? At every price, quantity demanded is now higher. So what's happened to my equilibrium? My equilibrium price has went up, and my equilibrium quantity from this change has also went up. So my demand increase, there we go. My demand increase caused my equilibrium price to go up, but it also caused my equilibrium quantity to go up. So whenever you have these simultaneous change examples, draw out each change, determine what impacts that change had on the price and quantity. Now, when I'm thinking about the total effect, so when these happen at the same time, what do I definitely know is going to happen to price here? Well, if they both push price up, I know my new equilibrium price will be higher. However, if they're pushing the equilibrium quantity in opposite directions, we would say the change to the equilibrium quantity, we don't know. It's what we say in economics, it's indeterminate, right? Anytime you have simultaneous changes that push something in opposite directions, you would say the change is indeterminate. Okay. Any questions on that before it adds a little wrinkle to this? Okay. All right. So, well, I'll bounce back to the slides and then I'll show you a reason why you shouldn't do them at the same time. So we kind of went through all of this in shorthand. We had the graph that I drew for you. Here's kind of a summary. There's 4 different combinations, right? If both supply and demand increase, both of those things would push the equilibrium quantity up, but they push price in opposite directions. So this would be if they happen simultaneously, you know quantity, the equilibrium quantity will be higher, but you don't know what's going to happen to the equilibrium price, or it would be indeterminate. So I wouldn't try to memorize the outcomes of these 4 different combinations of supply and demand changes. I would make sure I can draw out each change on its own and then compare what those effects are to say what's the total effect. Kind of like we did. If they're both pushing price in the same direction, we can say what's happening to the equilibrium price. If they push in opposite directions, like here, well, there I know the equilibrium quantity from a demand and supply decrease would be lower, but I don't know what's going to happen to the equilibrium price. So just working through more of these problems, like in the practice problems, I think will help. Obviously, like we don't have enough time to work through every one of the 4, but the way in which you would approach each one of these 4 is exactly the same as what we just did. Okay. Now, what you don't want to do, so in one like this, where the change in the quantity is indeterminate, if we had tried to draw these on the same graph, I'll show you why it's very easy to make an incorrect statement. So if I have supply, I have my demand curve, I've got my initial, and I'm just going to stop putting the E here. So just so I don't know, I don't have as much stuff going on. Here's my equilibrium price and quantity initially. If I had, oh, now I forget what we did. We did a supply decrease, and no one called me out on this. I'm writing quickly and talking, so I put these on the wrong thing. So if I had a supply decrease, right, looks something like this. But if at the same time, let's say I drew that demand increase very small, right? Well, now where's my new equilibrium point? It's where my new demand is equal to my new supply. So I might be like, oh yeah, it looks like my price went up and my quantity went down, right? However, if I had drawn that demand shift to be very large, where would my new equilibrium look like? Well, where would my new demand be equal to my new supply curve? Way out here, which would still look like, oh yeah, the price went up. However, if I drew it as a really large change here, it might look like the quantity went up. So this is why, if we had these two things happening at the same time, we know the price will be higher, but depending on the size of the shifts, because they were pushing the equilibrium quantity in opposite directions, when the supply shift was larger than the demand shift, it's the one that dominated and pushed the quantity down. When that supply shift wasn't as large and the demand shift was larger, it was the one where its effect was kind of winning out, right? And increasing our equilibrium quantity. So I won't ever give you questions where I say, this effect is larger than the other. All I'll expect you to know is if they're pushing it in opposite directions, we would say that that change in that equilibrium quantity is indeterminate. Okay. All right, any questions on this before we keep moving here? So there's one more example I want to work through, and we skipped it. It was way back up here. It was after surplus and shortages. Here we go. Slide 50. So I'm giving you a demand and supply equation here. We've been talking about equilibrium, how we identify it, the thing, when we have supply and demand shifts, how does it change? How could I identify it not from a graph, but from equations? So I've got a couple questions here, and we'll save this shortage one for Monday. But what if I have this supply and demand equation? So I've got my demand equation is 100 minus 5Q. My supply equation was what? 20 plus 15Q. And I want to know what's the marginal benefit of the fifth unit, the marginal cost of the third, and what's the equilibrium price and quantity. Okay. So I've got this information here. If I want to find the marginal benefit of the fifth unit, which of these would represent marginal benefits? We said demand represents the marginal benefit of the consumers for different quantities. So if I want to know the consumer's marginal benefit to the fifth unit, all I would do is plug that 5 into the quantity demanded. Right? So here I'd end up with what? 75. What if I want to know the marginal cost of the third unit? Well, there I would just take my supply curve, price reflects the marginal costs, and plug in that 3 for my quantity supply. This is going to give me what? 65. So I can use those equations to find the marginal benefit or marginal cost of any unit. Now, what if I wanted to solve for the equilibrium quantity and price here? If I'm given equations like this, I know the equilibrium price is where the equilibrium quantity supplied, the quantity supply is equal to the quantity demanded. But I also know it's the point where my supply curve is equal to my demand curve. Well, these curves, what are behind them? Equations. So all I'm going to do is set my supply and demand equations equal to each other. So I'm going to take my demand equation. It's going to be that point where they're the same price. So demand is 100 minus 5Q. That's going to be equal to my supply equation, 20 plus 15Q. Now from here, it's just a little bit of algebra. Subtract 20 from both sides, right? I get 80. Add 5Q to both sides. I get 20Q on this side. Divide both sides by 20. And I get what? That equilibrium quantity is going to be 4. Okay. So once I find my equilibrium quantity using my supply and demand equation, let's see if I can get this all on here. Well, here. That way I can, there we go. Once I have that equilibrium quantity, how can I find my equilibrium price, right? Well, at that equilibrium quantity of 4, if I plug it into my demand curve, it should tell me the corresponding price. If I plug it into my supply curve, it should tell me the corresponding price. So I really can do either one. In fact, if I do put it into both, I should get the same answer. So once we get to this step, you can always just plug it back into either supply or demand. But I'll kind of show you if you plug it into both, you can verify that you've done the math correctly. So if I look at my demand curve and I plug in that quantity of 4, right? The corresponding price would be 80. This should be my equilibrium price if I've identified the equilibrium quantity correct. I can double check this by figuring out what's the equilibrium price if I use my supply curve. Well, sure enough, I get that exact same equilibrium price. If I don't, I know that I probably made a math error somewhere, right? So what are kind of the general steps when you have these equations? Because you will see a question like this on the quiz exam. So the first thing that you'll do is kind of set your supply and demand equations equal to each other. Right? You'll then kind of solve or do the algebra to find that equilibrium quantity. You'll then take your equilibrium quantity and you'll plug it into your supply or demand equation, right? You only have to do one, right? You'll find the same value if you're doing the math correct. I would, if it was me and I was working through these problems, I would just plug it into both just to make sure I'm getting the same answer. And once you plug it in, right, you're just doing the algebra to then solve for what is that equilibrium price, okay? Any questions on this idea before we keep moving here? Okay. So that should cover it. Oh, it's going to get dark in here, but it's all right. You can still see this because I got a light. That should wrap it up for us here today. Like I said, we'll save the shortage surplus stuff for Monday. I will make available right now, while I'm thinking about it, that third quiz. It shouldn't have any questions related to surpluses or shortages on there. I kind of changed those to make sure that it only has what we've covered up through today. Although whatever module 3 material we start out and cover in the first probably 10 minutes of Monday's class, that shortage surplus stuff will be expected on the final, on the first midterm exam. Okay. All right, any other questions before I end the recording here? And then I'll kind of stay here for a couple minutes after.